ever lay awake at night and think, like, what is all this about? You know what I mean? Like, how did all this get here? What are we even doing here?
Yeah, totally. Sometimes I even feel a little small thinking about it.
It's kind of like we crave some sort of bigger picture, like what's the driving force behind everything?
Absolutely. And how can we even start to grasp it without getting lost in all the complexities?
Right. Well, that's exactly what we're going to try and do today, right here with you. We're diving deep into some pretty big questions about, well, God.
Exactly. We're going to be exploring the attributes of God as they are presented in this fascinating source material you've provided, the Urantia Book, Paper 3.
It's not just airy-fairy stuff either. This source lays out some really specific ideas about God's nature.
You're right. It gets into some pretty profound concepts.
Yeah, we're talking omnipresence, omnipotence, omniscience, limitlessness, supreme rule primacy.
It's a mouthful, isn't
Yeah.
it? But we're going to unpack all of that, make it clear, and, dare I say, enjoyable for you.
That's the plan, to offer those aha moments without making your head spin.
Yeah, it's like getting a crash course in some really deep philosophical and theological ideas.
And luckily, we've got an expert with us who can connect the dots and offer some insightful perspectives, right?
I'll do my best.
So are you ready to dive in with us? Our mission is simple. We're going to try to pull out the most important nuggets of knowledge about God's attributes from this Urantia book paper.
Sounds good to me.
Awesome. So let's get started. First up, God's omnipresence, which basically means God is everywhere, right?
Yeah, that's the gist of it. But it goes deeper than that. This source material claims that the Universal Father isn't just located somewhere, but is actually present throughout all creation simultaneously.
Everywhere at once, kind of mind-blowing, right?
It is. And it's not just a vague presence either. It even suggests that God is present within the hearts of his creation.
It's pretty powerful stuff. The book even quotes those awesome lines, "I am a God at hand as well as afar off, says the Lord. Do not I fill heaven and earth?"
It really drives home the point that God's presence isn't limited by space in any way.
Totally. And get this, the book goes on to describe God as the fullness of him who fills all and in all.
It really makes you think about the relationship between creator and creation.
I know. It's like, how can something be present everywhere and also bigger than everything?
Exactly. The universe exists within God, yet God is infinitely greater than the sum of all that exists. It almost seems like a contradiction.
It's a tough one to wrap your head around, for sure. But the source material takes it even further, suggesting a really intimate connection between God and creation.
Oh yeah, you mean the idea that God lives in creatures through this indwelling spirit called the thought adjuster.
Yes. It even says the spirit of the everlasting Father is concealed in the mind of every mortal child.
So it's not just about a distant God out there somewhere. This suggests an active personal presence within our very consciousness.
But it doesn't sound like this presence is felt equally everywhere, right?
You're picking up on a key point there. The book mentions it's related to the evolving presence of something called the Supreme Being, and how much different parts of the universe recognize and are loyal to God.
So there are areas that are maybe less receptive to God's presence.
Exactly. And that actually leads to the concept of what the source material calls quarantine for planets in spiritual darkness.
Quarantine, that sounds intense.
It does, but it's not meant to be punitive. Think of it as a protective measure by the larger, healthier parts of creation, to safeguard that divine presence from the effects of widespread rejection and rebellion.
I guess that makes sense. So it sounds like the degree of God's presence is dynamic in a way.
Yes, but the book is careful to clarify that any fluctuations we perceive in God's presence aren't because God is changing or withdrawing.
Okay, so what causes the fluctuations?
It's about our own choices and how much we're aligning ourselves with that indwelling adjuster.
Gotcha. So it's more about our receptivity than God's actual presence. That's an interesting distinction.
It is.
Hmm.
And it challenges us to consider how our actions and choices might affect our own experience of that presence. So we move from omnipresence to omnipotence, God's infinite power.
Yeah, and the source doesn't mince words. It states the Lord God omnipotent reigns, and that all things are divinely supervised.
It's a bold statement about ultimate control. And it goes on to say that with God, all things are possible.
Within the bounds of divine nature, of course.
Of course. But it still paints a picture of a universe unfolding according to a divine plan with an inherent harmony and order.
I was really struck by how the source connects God to the very foundation of the universe.
How so?
It calls God the primal cause behind all physical phenomena, the source of energy, and even a special kind of light.
Light without heat.
Yes, isn't that wild? It even mentions another form of energy, a non-spiritual one that we don't fully understand yet.
And it talks about God's control over all these fundamental forces. Energy, lightning, even the circuits of all energy are described as being held within his grasp.
Yeah, all centered on paradise. It's a pretty awe-inspiring image.
It is, but we also have to remember that the source points out that our human minds don't directly respond to this universal fatherly power.
Right, the interaction happens through those thought adjusters.
Exactly. It's not like God is directly pulling the strings of our thoughts and actions. It's a more subtle internal influence.
And the text is very clear that God's power is not some transient or fluctuating force. It's always adequate for whatever needs to happen in the universe. But then this brings up a question that I think a lot of people wrestle with.
What's that?
If God has all this power, why is there so much suffering and injustice in the world? Why do bad things happen seemingly randomly or even cruelly?
That's the age-old question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And the source material doesn't shy away from it. It acknowledges the tension, but suggests that what we perceive as arbitrary or cruel divine actions stems from our limited human viewpoint.
So it's about our perspective.
Right. We simply don't have the capacity to understand the bigger picture or the higher laws at play.
So we can't always see the purpose behind God's actions.
Exactly. And even though we may not always grasp it, the source assures us that God's actions are ultimately purposeful and directed towards the greatest good for all.
Okay, so even when things seem bad, God is working towards the good of everyone.
That's the idea. It also introduces this concept of us being part of a larger divine family. And sometimes what we perceive as hardship might be a form of family discipline.
Like tough love from a cosmic parent.
You can say that. And the text goes on to outline 3 key aspects that guide how God's spiritual power manifests in the universe.
What are those 3 things?
Well, first, his own nature, which is characterized by love, truth, beauty, and goodness. Second, his will, which is motivated by mercy and a fatherly relationship with his creation. And third, his law, which embodies the principles of righteousness and the justice of the Trinity.
So God's actions are always in alignment with those 3 things.
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense.
It does. And it's not that God's power is limited by these aspects, but rather that they are expressions of his perfect character. Next up, we have omniscience, God's universal knowledge. The source states very simply, God knows all things.
Wow, that's a big statement.
It is. And it doesn't stop there. It says God is also conscious of the thought of all creation, every thought of every being everywhere.
No pressure, right?
Right. And the source material offers some vivid illustrations to bring this point home.
Like what?
Well, for example, it talks about how the one who balances the clouds is also perfect in knowledge.
Okay, yeah, I get it.
And then there's that powerful line, the eyes of the Lord are in every place. Even the teachings of Jesus are referenced, like how God knows when a sparrow falls and has counted every hair on our heads.
Those little details make it feel a lot more personal, don't they?
Absolutely. It highlights that God isn't just aware of the grand scheme of things, but also the individual experiences of every single being. The joys, the sorrows, all of it.
It kind of makes you feel seen, doesn't it? Like really known.
It does. And there's something very comforting about phrases like, he knows your frame, he remembers that you are dust, and your Father knows what you have need of even before you ask him.
Yeah, those are good ones. But how does God actually possess this vast knowledge?
The source explains it's through a combination of direct and indirect awareness. Direct awareness through those indwelling adjusters, and indirectly through the divine sons and the omnipresent infinite spirit.
So it's like a multi-layered system of knowing.
Exactly. It ensures a complete understanding of everything happening throughout creation. Now, of course, this raises another question. Does God know in advance if we will choose to do wrong?
That's a tough one.
It is. And the source material doesn't give us a simple yes or no answer, but it does make a crucial point. Even if God does have foreknowledge of our choices, it doesn't take away our freedom to make those choices.
Okay, so free will is still intact.
Yes. And importantly, the text emphasizes that God is never surprised by anything that happens.
So no matter what we do, God is never caught off guard.
Exactly. Moving on, let's talk about God's limitlessness. The source is very clear that God giving of himself to the universes doesn't diminish his own power, wisdom, or love.
So even though God is constantly creating and giving his essence never runs out.
Right. The source material uses the analogy of adjusting gravity for newly forming universes.
Gravity adjustment, how does that work?
Well, it's just an analogy to illustrate that even with the continuous creation of new realities, God's power to control and coordinate everything remains perfectly adequate. It speaks to the inexhaustible nature of God's being.
I see. So it's not a finite resource that gets depleted.
Exactly. And it's not just about power. The constant distribution of mind and spirit to creatures throughout the cosmos doesn't deplete the original source of divine wisdom either. It's like a light that can illuminate countless other lights without dimming itself.
That's a beautiful way to put it.
The text describes the potential for growth and spiritual development created by God's Spirit indwelling in mortals as limitless. And while our human minds can't fully grasp the concept of infinity, we are capable of experiencing the full impact of God's infinite love.
So even though we can't fully comprehend infinity, we can still experience its effects in a very real way.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the source suggests that our capacity to even appreciate these infinite qualities comes from the fact that we're made in God's image.
So that spark of infinity within us allows us to connect with the infinite nature of God.
That's the idea. And it makes love the closest we can get to truly understanding God's nature.
Fascinating. All right, let's move on to the Father's supreme role. The source material explains that in the creations beyond the central realm, God primarily exercises his power and authority through his divine sons and other subordinate beings.
Yes, it's like a delegation of authority. But it emphasizes that God only intervenes directly when those delegated authorities are unable to act effectively.
So God is ultimately in control, but he chooses to work through others.
Right. And this speaks to a profound aspect of God's nature, a divine selflessness. However, the ultimate authority always remains with the Father. He retains the power of veto, so to speak.
I see. And the structure of the universe with its different levels of governance reflects this hierarchical yet unified system.
Yes. And the source even uses familiar phrases like, "The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof," and "the Most High's rule in the kingdoms of men."
Powerful stuff. But it's important to note that while God's plan for the universe will ultimately be fulfilled, the text acknowledges that he may not always get his way in the day-to-day choices of individual hearts.
Right. Free will is still a factor.
So there's a tension between God's will and our individual choices.
There is. And the source material even suggests that the uncertainties and challenges we face in life are actually essential for our development.
Wait, so our struggles are actually good for us?
Well, in a way, yes. The text argues that these difficulties are necessary for us to develop qualities like courage, altruism, hope, faith, love of truth, idealism, and loyalty.
So instead of seeing those things as random or meaningless, they actually contribute to our growth.
Exactly. They become opportunities for us to consciously choose good over evil and to develop our moral character.
And this is in contrast to the beings in the central universe who are inherently perfect.
Right. They don't have to go through the same process of growth and development that we do.
So our struggles are part of what makes us unique and valuable in a way.
You could say that. Okay, lastly, let's talk about the Father's primacy. The source material really stresses God's ultimate control and power of final decision, even while delegating authority.
So it's like God is the CEO of the universe.
In a sense, yes. God's sovereignty is presented as unlimited, the foundational truth upon which all of reality rests. The universe isn't an accident or something that simply exists on its own. It's a purposeful creation dependent on the Creator's will, which is defined by divine truth and living love.
And this idea of unified rule by one God is actually central to religious philosophy.
It is. The source reasons that the ultimate cause of all things must be greater than the sum of its effects. And it cautions us against both humanizing God and nechanizing God.
So finding that balance between the personal and the transcendent.
Exactly. The text even touches on the question of whether God suffers. While it doesn't offer a definitive answer, it suggests that if beings like the Creator's sons and the Infinite Spirit can experience suffering in modified ways, then it's conceivable that the Universal Father might also experience it in some manner.
That's a pretty radical thought.
It is, and it points to the profound connection and empathy the Father has for his creation. The source ultimately summarizes God not just as power and form and energy, but also as personal.
Personal in what sense?
Possessing sovereign will, self-consciousness, a creative mind, an eternal purpose, and ultimately fatherly love. And it suggests that these personal traits are most clearly revealed through the life of Michael on Urantia.
Which, of course, is another deep dive for another day.
Absolutely. And it concludes beautifully with this concept of a triune function. God the Father loves God, the Son serves God, the Spirit inspires our journey, to find God the Father.
What a beautiful summary of the Trinity. So there you have it, folks. We've explored the key attributes of God as presented in the Urantia Book, Paper 3. Omnipresence, omnipotence, omniscience, limitlessness, supreme rule, and primacy.
Quite the journey, wasn't it? We started with those basic human questions about the nature of existence, and we've arrived at this intricate picture of a personal yet transcendent God.
And for you, our listener who's been with us on this deep dive, we hope this has given you a more structured and insightful understanding of these profound concepts.
It's a lot to ponder, for sure.
Yeah.
It might even change the way you view your own life and the universe around you. Considering the sheer scale and complexity of God's attributes, what do you think about your own potential for growth and understanding within such a vast universe?
That's a powerful question to sit with. And we encourage you to dive back into the Urantia Book, Paper 3, or explore other philosophical and theological ideas that spark your curiosity. This deep dive is really just a starting point for what could be a lifelong journey of discovery.
Exactly. Keep exploring, keep questioning, keep seeking.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and we'll see you next time.
See you then.